Okay, hello everybody. Um, welcome to class number 3 of ethical and legal issues in psychology. It's good to have you all here. Hopefully, you are seeing this. What I mean by that is I am using a different system for getting this material out to you, getting the lecture out to you. As you may notice, the link that you had for this, or I expect the link that you had for this, was a YouTube link. I was having some trouble with the size of the recordings that I was using for the lectures. Sometimes there'd be some problems getting it to download into Moodle. So I switched, or my plan is to switch. So hopefully this worked. And what it is I now have the recordings on YouTube, and then the link that you receive for the class will just be the link to the YouTube video. And YouTube does not have a problem with the size of it. So the fact that these are hour-long lectures shouldn't impact too much on uh, on you being able to download it. Okay, so I know you read I know you read the chapter on resolving ethical issues for this class, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, about how you go about deciding how to resolve ethical issues. And I'm going to be talking about different um, types of models that are used for helping psychologists resolve ethical issues in different types of situations. And I have a number of different situations that I'm going to be talking about. Uh, so let me just delve right into it. One is uh, what is called a positive ethical model, and it is specifically an ethical decision making model that I'm going to be applying to a forensic psychologist, or I'm sorry, a forensic psychology uh, situation. Now, this is a model approach that could be used in a number of different types of settings, but I'm going to be specifically giving an example, a forensic or a forensic psychology situation. So here are the steps to this particular ethical model. Step one, identify the problem. Two, consider the significance of the context and setting. Three, identify and utilize ethical and legal resources. Four, consider personal beliefs and problems. Five, develop possible solutions to the problems. Six, consider the potential consequences of various solutions. Seven, choose and implement a course of action. And eight, assess the outcome and implement changes as needed. I will go through those 8 steps again, but this is considered a positive ethical decision making model. And notice how only one step, uh, step three, actually would relate directly to turning towards the APA ethics code, identify and utilize ethical and legal resources. So you would need to know the ethics code and you would need to know the legal resources, but the decision that you would make, even based on the ethical guidelines and the law, is only one step of 8 in this model. So it shows how complex this whole process can be. So let me go through those 8 steps again. Identify the problem, consider that's step one. Step two, consider the significance of the context and setting. Step three, identify and utilize ethical and legal resources, in this case, the ethics code and the legal statutes that would apply. Step four, consider personal beliefs and values. Step 5, develop possible solutions to the problem. Step 6, consider the potential consequences of those various solutions. Step 7, choose and implement a course of action. And step 8, assess the outcome and implement changes as needed. Now I'm going to go through an example using this positive ethical decision-making model. Joe is your 16-year-old client who came to therapy because of having low self-esteem and being depressed about his parents' divorce. Both the mother and father are fighting for custody of Joe. In the course of therapy, Joe reported that he has begun having thoughts of self harm. Here are some ethical issues that come up. Is it ethical? Is it your ethical responsibility to talk to the parents? And do you have a duty to tell the parents because Joe is under 18? And should you not involve the parents at all? Um, and by the way, I apologize. I realized as I was doing this that I need to change this scenario just a little bit. And instead of Joe being 16, Joe is 13. And I apologize for that. I will make a side note. I had this was from a couple years ago. In recent years, the laws in several states have changed, and they have actually set the 18 is still considered legally an adult, but many states have changed it to where minors over 14 can make their own decisions about whether to be in therapy. And the question about how much to release to a parent becomes somewhat more up in the air when a child is between 14 and 18. It becomes a little bit more complex that we will talk about later on when we get into some of the details regarding the law and ethics. But in this case, I need to change the age of Joe to 13. Okay, so the first situation is, or the notice with step one, you identify the problem. And the problem is it your ethical responsibility to talk to the parents? And do you have a duty to talk to the parents because Joe is a minor? Or should you just not involve the parents at all? That's identifying the problem. Consider step two, consider the significance of the context and the setting. Uh, the the client is a minor. Um, how which parent? But remember, um, uh, remember that they're divorced. So the question then becomes, which parent do you talk to? How do you determine who has legal guardianship? Would it hurt the therapy? Would it stop the therapy? Would it stop Joe's progress if you were to tell the parents? But would there be consequences if you didn't tell the parents? Step three, identify and utilize ethical and legal resources. So you would go to the ethics code. Um, you would look up the legal statutes as they apply to privacy. You would look up the state law as they apply to privacy and informing parents. You would find out, you would consult your relevant professional organization and talk to colleagues if they were available. That's step three. Um, and the in the ethics code, um, there would be a couple things to keep in mind. First off, and sort of this is the general overview of ethics across the board, is first off, do no harm. So um, if you would have reason to think that um, that this is going to harm the therapy, and that Joe is not in immediate danger. Because I guess there's one thing I want to point out here. Um, Notice, I want to stress here that the reason this is an ethical consideration is that Joe is reporting that he is having thoughts of self harm. That's why the question come up. If Joe were just suicidal, if Joe were essentially saying, I'm going to go home and slit my wrists, then you wouldn't even call the parents. You would call, um, you would either go about the process of getting Joe admitted to the hospital if you're able to do that in your state, or um, you would go through the process of getting Joe involved with a crisis agency or a hospital where they could admit Joe. That issue differs. This is one of those legal issues that differs from state to state. I am in the state of Pennsylvania. In the state of Pennsylvania, if Joe were, even if Joe were um, uh, threatening, and I knew Joe was going to kill himself, or was thinking seriously, or was planning to kill himself, um, I would actually not be able to admit Joe to a hospital because in the state of Pennsylvania, only medical doctors, mostly psychiatrists, can admit someone directly to a hospital without them signing in. What I would have to do is call a crisis agency who would um, either I would convince Joe to go to the hospital himself, and then I would contact the hospital and let them know what I heard Joe say, or I would contact a crisis management agency who would go see Joe or come to my office as Joe was still in my office and determine if Joe should be hospitalized. They would talk to me, they would get information from me, but I would not be the one to admit Joe. In some states, psychologists can directly admit a suicidal client to the to the hospital. So keep in mind where this issue, why this whole thing becomes a scenario, because we're not talking about Joe being clearly suicidal. If Joe was clearly suicidal, the issue of informing the parents would be moot because you wouldn't be informing the parents, you'd be informing the hospital or the crisis management agency who could admit Joe to the hospital. You might inform the parents later on what happened, but it wouldn't be the parents that you would be talking to. So in this case, we're talking about Joe having thoughts of suicide, but not making threats of suicide. Now, when you get to the ethics code here, some of the ethical issues that apply is one is you want to make sure you're not doing any harm to the client, and if very often if a client reports to you that they are having thoughts of self harm but are not actively having any intent or any plan, you would probably be doing more harm than good by informing the parents because you'd be breaking confidentiality, but you also could make the case that you would be breaking the trust that the client has established with you. And especially for a 13-year-old, that would be pretty detrimental to the therapy. Also, um, even with a minor, uh, you still cannot disclose very much without the patient's consent. Um, Now, the limits on that are if the suicidal thoughts turn into suicidal ideation or suicidal intent. In that case, you would still, that's where you would inform people, but you'd probably even skip over the parents there and just get the crisis management agency or the hospital involved. So there is still, so do no harm is sort of the general. Also, um, even clients who are minors have um, have a have a right to expect confidentiality. So, and the fact that Joe is 13 is because in every state, um, confidentiality is expected for minors 12 and above. So if you're talking about children and preteens, that's an entirely different category. But when they get to be 12 and above, um, there is still an expectation that they will be able to expect confidentiality, uh, unless there's some serious uh, concerns about self harm or harm to others. So if Joe does not present an imminent threat to himself, then you would have to give a lot of weight to confidentiality. And you would have to give a lot of weight to how you're breaking that confidentiality to inform his parents that he's having thoughts of harming himself, what that would do to the therapy and how that probably would have a major impact on trust. Uh, okay, and now for the next step four, consider personal beliefs and values. This is where you'd have to make your own decision about how you feel about the situation. Um, for instance, how do you feel about breaking confidentiality? Do you feel that you might alienate Joe if you broke confidentiality, or do you feel that it's more important to involve the family as much as possible? Uh, do you feel that you might be hurting the relationship if you did tell the parents that Joe was having suicidal thoughts? Um, because that might make them uh, more distressed and cause more difficulties in the family environment. Um, so that's step four. Step five, what are some of the possible solutions to the problem? One would be, and this would probably be the top of it, is perform a suicidal lethality assessment. This is where you assess how likely is it that these thoughts could turn into actual intent or plan. If you decide based on the other four steps that you do need to inform the parents, it probably would be very important to let Joe know what you're about to do and why you're doing it. So don't catch Joe by, so at the very least, as far as not harming the client, be upfront with Joe before you inform the parents, saying, this is why I'm telling your parents. Um, and then maybe as part of the therapy session, what you want to do is get into a logical discussion with Joe. So not only informing him that you're telling his parents and why, but get into a discussion of what the pros and cons would have been and why you think the pros of telling his parents outweighed the cons. Um, Another possible solution to this would be to inform the parents and inform them with Joe there so that you can help the family sort of start to communicate about how they're going to deal with this so they're not totally on your own. Um, Now, if Joe is of age and does not want you to inform his parents and says adamantly that he does not want you to inform his parents, and you are not on solid legal ground where you are so concerned about his safety that you could make the case for breaking confidentiality, even though Joe doesn't agree with it, you could work out a plan with Joe to where he calls you during the week to check in, and also where he agrees to call the suicide hotline if he starts to if his thoughts turn into an actual plan. Step number six, to consider the potential consequences um, of various solutions. If you do a suicide lethality assessment, you could determine that Joe is uh, suicidal, and this could lead to him being hospitalized. Um, if you are working with Joe to go over the pros and cons of you telling the parents, it may be that even though you think the pros outweigh the cons, that he may decide differently and think the cons outweigh the pros. Um, so one possible outcome could be that he agrees with you that the pros outweigh the cons, but another possible outcome could be that he disagrees with you and think that no, the cons outweigh the pros, and that he doesn't say straight out that he allows you to talk to his parents. Um, and one possible additional outcome, if Joe does not give you permission or whatever other reason you decide not to tell Joe's parents, then um, it may be that Joe doesn't end up getting the sort of support that might help to lessen his suicidal thoughts as time goes on. Then, based on 6 and 7, based on where you sort of weigh what the possible solutions are and what the possible outcomes of those solutions are, step number 7 is choose and implement a course of action. If you decide that Joe is not actively suicidal, that he is not, that he is having suicidal thoughts, but you are comfortable, even after a more formal assessment, that he is not having any plans or intent, then your decision might be to monitor him in therapy, uh, to make sure he knows how to call the suicide hotline and agrees to do that if things get worse. And then if he doesn't give you permission to tell his parents, then you would encourage him to tell his parents or get additional help from friends and family, and maybe even check in with you in between sessions. Um, if he is actively suicidal, then you move forward with the hospitalization, and again continue to talk with Joe about the pros and cons of telling his parents. But even if he doesn't agree, if he's actively suicidal, then you may decide that you have to tell his parents anyway, uh, even if he doesn't agree. And again, you can break confidentiality. That's where you have to, through your decision making process, reach the decision that even if he doesn't give permission, that breaking confidentiality is necessary to prevent John from harming himself, or to prevent Joe from harming himself. Um, and then the last step is assess the outcome and implement changes as needed. So as you monitor Joe in therapy, uh, you start to determine, is this effective? Is this what's help? Is this helping him get better? Um, and is he actually going to family and friends for support, even if he's not sharing with them that he's having suicidal thoughts, but is having that access to his parents and friends and family, helping to lessen his degree of emotional distress. You might also decide that if Joe doesn't seem to get better, you might decide, well, is it possible he needs a referral for psychiatric services, medication management? Um, Once he's in the hospital, if he's actively suicidal, uh, work with him about how he reacted to being in the hospital, and work with him on finding out how his parents felt about him being hospitalized. So step 8 is to sort of assess as you go on, um, as you go on, to see how effective your steps were um, in getting Joe the help that he needs. Okay, so that is a positive ethical decision making approach. Um, I'm going to go to model number 2, which is a slightly different one and is considered a more active ethical decision model. Um, so this is considered a more act. It's also positive, but it's considered um, uh, it is considered to be a more active approach. And here are the steps here. First is determine whether the matter truly involves ethics. So the first step here is you determine whether this is actually an ethical decision or not. Is there an ethical code involved? Um, Step 2, consult the ethical guidelines that are available to you and which ones apply. So you sort of start off by with the ethical guidelines in this approach. But you start by determining, does the matter truly involve um, ethics at all? And then you determine, okay, which ethical principle applies in this situation. And then three, pause to consider all the factors that might influence the decision you will make. Step four, consult with a trusted colleague. And this could be either another professional that you know, or um, as I told you in an earlier class, a lot of state psychological associations have ethical consultants who are part of their staff. And that if you're a member of that organization, that may be a service that is available to you to have an ethical consultant available. Step five, evaluate the rights, responsibilities, and vulnerability of all the affected parties. Step six, generate alternative decisions. Step seven, determine the consequences and or potential consequences of making each decision. Step eight, make the decision. And step nine, implement the decision. And uh, for the ethical example, um, I want to talk about here. A student tells a school counselor about another student threatening her on Facebook, and the school has to decide how to proceed. So a student, well, in this case, let's make it the student psychologist. A student tells us the school psychologist about another student threatening her on Facebook, and the school has to decide how to proceed. So the first question is this an ethical issue at all? Does it involve um, ethical standards? Does the school psychologist have to do anything at all because the threat was online? Um, and is there an ethical duty to protect the student because he or she is a minor? Um, and then you start looking at guidelines. Step two, consult guidelines that are already available. This would be not only the APA ethics guideline. So in step one, you would use the ethical guidelines to determine whether there was an ethical issue at all. And then if you did decide that there was one, you would consult the ethical guidelines. Other guidelines that you might want to use is the school's policies regarding cyberbullying. Um, and are there any legal statutes that apply to how schools are supposed to handle cyberbullying? Um, and then an example that I had here, because the case I was talking about is one that just happened to be in Illinois. Um, the Illinois General Assembly um, has as part of their code for schools um, that uh, one of their regulations is that the public school staff should be involved in the teaching of respect and moral courage for the purpose of lessening crime and raising the standard of good character. So it just so happens that in the state of Illinois, there actually is a legal statute that the schools are supposed to be involved in helping to teach students some degree of respect, and that the code, the legal statute actually mentions the recognizing and reporting of online harassment and cyberbullying. Um, and um, in Illinois law, it is actually considered a pretty serious crime to threaten or kill, even if the threat is made online. So, step three of this approach, pause to consider as best as possible all factors that might influence the decision you will make. Um, And some factors that you want to keep in mind are what was the threat? What specifically was said on Facebook? Was it vague or specific? How many times has this happened? Is it a one time occurrence or a repetitive occurrence? Consider the harassed student's statement. Keep in mind that if one student is being threatened, other students could be in the same situation. Those are some factors to consider when making the decision about what to do next. Step 4, consult with a trusted colleague. In the case of the school psychologist, it could be the State Psychological Association, it could be the principal of the school, it could be other school psychologists. Um, it also could be academic materials, books, journal publications that address this issue specifically. In more severe circumstances, you might even want to contact the police department to see if they have any suggestions about what they would do if it was reported to them. Step 5, evaluate the rights, responsibilities, and vulnerability of all effective parties. And this has to do with just considering um, not only the student being harassed, but also, you know, the rights of the child who's being accused of harassing. I mean, once this becomes a formal complaint, then that student would have to give their point of view, and maybe it'll end up being different than what you're hearing from the student. Keep in mind, that you have to keep in mind the safety of everybody else at the school. Uh, Step 6, um, generate alternative decisions. So rather than making a formal complaint against the student who is doing the harassing, a formal complaint to the school, um, or a formal statement to the school, some other solutions might be um, for someone else at the school to talk to each child separately and get the full story of what was going on. Possibly talk to both of the children together, get the parents involved, um, get a printout of what was written on Facebook so that different staff at the school can get together and sort of decide what to do next. Um, Step 7, determine the consequences of making each decision. So if you ask the student to print out the Facebook page, you could then start to determine whether there is evidence of harassment. Um, if it turns out that maybe the student who had talked about the harassment, if it looks like maybe there wasn't actually harassment, if maybe it looks like the wording was misconstrued by the statement, then you can talk to the student about how he or she interpreted what was written, and try to figure out what might have caused the misinterpretation. Um, so if it looks like that the student may have sort of overreacted to the Facebook post, you could then start to work with the student on helping to figure out what may have happened um, there. Uh, if it looks like it may have been harassment, then you would move forward with getting someone at the school to talk to both children separately, and find out what would have led to this sort of behavior from the one student. If you decide to talk to both children together, you could do a conflict resolution session to try to figure out what the problems are before involving any police or higher authority. If you involve the parents, you could get them involved in helping with the conflict resolution. If you then, and this is still part of step 7, where you figure out what the possible outcomes would be. If you end up calling the police, um, the plus is that you get um, some direct involvement with the student doing the harassing, and interventions could be put in place to try to stop this behavior and get the child the help that they might need. Now, the cons, the negatives to this would be that the child would then have a record that would continue to follow them even after the situation is over, although typically that record would be sealed and would only be able to be accessed by law enforcement. And then based on everything you go to step 8 and 9, you make the decision and implement the decision. Now notice that the second approach to ethics is usually used for is used here in a situation where um, the psychologist is involved in deciding what to do, but the primary concern isn't the therapeutic relationship and what this would do to the therapeutic relationship. So there's much more of an action involved here because the school psychologist in this point would be worried about um, getting this situation involved, but would not necessarily be as worried about the therapeutic relationship. Sort of the difference between the first steps, the first approach to ethical decision making, and the second approach is the first one is one you would typically use more often when you have to take into account what is this going to do to the therapeutic relationship. Um, is this going to hurt it? Is it going to end it? You know, is my role in this individual's life going to be over if I report what's going on? The second one is much more clearly a situation where the concerns are more outside of the therapeutic relationship. Um, and then, so um, uh, those are two approaches to ethical decision making. Um, I want to then talk about a third approach to ethical decision making, which is considered to be one that is more general um, and also more of a reflective approach. So these steps, there's 7 steps. Step 1 is recognize a problem. 2 is define the problem. 3 is develop solutions. 4 is choosing a solution. 5 is reviewing the process. 6 is implementing and evaluating a decision. And 7 is continuing reflection. Now, these 7 steps probably sound similar to the steps in the other 2 ethical approaches, but this one is just considered a more reflective approach. Um, and probably takes into even more into account the therapeutic rapport and the therapeutic relationship that already exists in the therapy. And here's an example of how this approach might be used. A 12-year-old girl is forced to go into therapy because of acting out at school. During the first session with the adolescent, the therapist finds out that the girl is actively abusing marijuana and possibly ecstasy with her friends. The parents do not know this information. And sort of the ethical question that comes up there is, do you tell the parents? Um, uh, Step 1 is recognizing the problem, which we just stated it there. Um, Step 2, define the problem. And the problem is the definition of the problem is you're uncertain whether to tell the parents. If you tell the parents, you run the risk of alienating the client, um, and this could cause irreparable harm to the therapeutic relationship. But if you do not tell the parents, they cannot intervene and get additional help for their daughter. You also run the risk of the girl getting arrested, creating brain damage, uh, and possibly overdosing from her drug use. Uh, Step three, develop solutions. Um, if you decide to tell the parents, you work with them on finding ways to help maintain their daughter's uh, safety. Um, Now, if you do not tell the parents, what you have done there is you have helped this child feel like they are an equal human being to the adults. And this is something that a lot of people write about this particular approach. It is stressed as one that is really an egalitarian approach, that this approach emphasizes that there is equality between the therapist and the patient, even if the patient is 12 years old. And um, that you are, if you decide not to tell the parents, one um, factor that is in your corner is you are helping to make clear to this young client that this young client is an equal human being to you, and that you recognize their self worth and equality to you. Now, some states, now I know I said before, um, uh, 12 and older, there's still an expectation for confidentiality. So this would apply here. There are therapists are still expected to maintain a good deal of confidentiality for clients who are 12 and older. It's not 100%. It's not the same as 18-year-olds, but there's still confidentiality. So you would also have the law on your side. Step four, choosing a solution. And in the authors of this method, there are some specific questions that they suggest the therapist ask. What is the best fit both emotionally and rationally? Does the solution meet everyone's needs, including mine? And can I implement and live with the effects? Also, another question to ask is what are the laws and formal ethical principles that apply here? So, those are some questions that you should keep in mind when trying to choose a solution. That is step four. Step five, um, review the process. And again, along the same lines as step four, the ways the authors of this approach suggest addressing this is through a series of questions. So when you're reviewing the process that you used, some questions you want to ask is, would I want to be treated this way? Does the decision feel right? Would would this decision withstand the scrutiny of others? How are my values and personal characteristics influencing my choice? And next, have I taken the client's perspective into account? So, would I want to be treated this way? Does the decision feel right? Would this decision withstand the scrutiny of others? How are my values, personal characteristics influencing my choice? And have I taken the client's perspective into account? Step six, implementing and evaluating the decision. You carry out the decision, but again, in an indication that this is a very reflective approach to ethical decision making, you ask questions like, is the solution the best I can do? And you observe consequences, and as the therapy goes on, you reassess the decision by asking, how has this decision affected the therapeutic process? And again, continuing with this idea, this is a very reflective approach to ethical decision making. Um, Step 7 is continuing reflection. So questions you ask is, what did I learn? Have I changed as a result of this process, and how have I changed? What would I do differently? And how might this experience affect me in the future? So some questions here is, what did I learn? How have I changed as a result of this process? What would I do differently? And how might this experience affect me in the future? Okay, so those are three models to decision making. One is a positive uh, decision making model. Second one is a more active decision making model. And the third is a more reflective ethical decision making model. I also do realize that I brought this up as an example um, of some different approaches to making, excuse me a sec, to making ethical decisions. I do realize that all three of the examples I used involved minors, individuals under 18. That just makes that was just that makes up some very significant ethical quandaries that clinicians often find themselves in. When you have someone who's under 18, you have to take a lot of other factors into account. And so I thought that was important to bring up. They would apply to others, and certainly during the class, maybe we can look at some other ways that these ethical decision making models could be applied. But I think for right now, this is a good place to stop. I do realize in class at the live lecture, we will have to talk about, I will talk a little bit also about next week you will get your first exam. And well, no, your first exam will be due next week. So I will have it out uh, soon after our live lecture on Thursday. Okay, so I will see you all on, oh, I'm sorry, our live lecture on Friday. So I will see you all on Friday. Thank you very much.